What if Nazis had won World War II? World War II was one of the most pivotal events in human history, shaping the world in ways that resonate to this day. It was not just a conflict of armies but also a clash of ideologies, with the Allies fighting against the totalitarian, racist, and imperialist ambitions of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The defeat of the Axis powers led to the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, the decolonization of much of the world, and the establishment of institutions like the United Nations aimed at maintaining global peace. But what if the outcome had been different? What if, instead of being defeated, Nazi Germany had emerged victorious? Such a scenario would have radically altered the political, social, economic, and cultural landscape of the world. This essay will explore what the world might have looked like had the Nazis won World War II, examining the potential effects on global politics, race relations, culture, science, and the overall course of history. The global political landscape. Had Nazi Germany won World War II, the global political landscape would have been dramatically different. The Third Reich, under Adolf Hitler, had a vision of establishing a thousand-year Reich, an empire that would dominate Europe and eventually the world. The immediate consequences of a Nazi victory in Europe would likely have included the complete annexation or subjugation of all European countries. Countries such as France, Britain, and the Soviet Union would either have been directly controlled by Germany or turned into puppet states, ruled by regimes loyal to the Nazis. 1. Europe under Nazi rule. Europe, the continent that bore the brunt of Nazi aggression, would have been transformed into a fascist dystopia. Hitler's plans for Europe involved not only the military conquest of the continent, but also the complete restructuring of its populations. The Nazi regime's racial ideology, which held that Germans were a master race, would have led to the systematic extermination of millions more people. The Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews, would likely have expanded to other groups that the Nazis deemed undesirable, including Slavs, Romani people, disabled individuals, and political dissidents. Eastern Europe would have been particularly affected. Hitler's plan, known as Generalplan Ost, involved the complete colonization of Eastern Europe. Millions of Slavic people were to be either exterminated or enslaved to make room for German settlers. Cities like Warsaw and Moscow might have been razed to the ground, replaced by German-controlled settlements. The Lebensraum, living space, ideology would have been realized, with vast tracts of Eastern European land being seized for German expansion. This would have resulted in the complete destruction of Slavic culture and the disappearance of nations like Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus from the map. 2. The fate of Britain. The fate of Britain would have depended on whether or not it was successfully invaded. Operation Sea Lion, the Nazi plan to invade the United Kingdom, was never carried out due to Germany's failure to achieve air superiority in the Battle of Britain. However, in a scenario where Nazi Germany won the war, it is conceivable that Britain could have been invaded and occupied. Britain might have been subjected to a Nazi puppet government, potentially led by British fascist sympathizers like Oswald Mosley. The British Empire, which was already in decline, would likely have disintegrated, with Germany seizing control of key British colonies, such as India and parts of Africa, to expand its global influence. 3. The United States. Across the Atlantic, the United States would have faced a vastly different geopolitical situation. With Europe under Nazi control and much of Asia dominated by Imperial Japan, the US would have found itself isolated, potentially vulnerable to attack or diplomatic pressure from the Axis powers. If the US had not entered the war, or if it had been defeated by the Axis powers, it could have faced significant internal strife. The isolationist tendencies that existed before Pearl Harbor might have grown stronger, and far-right ideologies could have gained traction in American politics. Alternatively, the US might have been forced to accept a tense coexistence with the Axis, leading to a Cold War-like situation between fascism and democracy, with the US being a lone democratic state in a world dominated by totalitarian regimes. Race relations and the New World Order. Nazi ideology was built on a foundation of racial purity and Aryan supremacy. The concept of a master race dictated Nazi policy, and a world in which the Nazis had won would have seen these beliefs institutionalized on a global scale. 1. Systematic extermination and genocide. The Holocaust would not have ended with the defeat of the Jews. In fact, it was only the beginning. Other ethnic groups deemed inferior by the Nazis, such as the Slavs, Romani people, and Africans, would have faced genocide. The goal of the Nazis was to create a racially homogeneous empire, and this would have been pursued through mass murder on an even larger scale than what was witnessed during the actual war. In the colonies of Africa, where Nazi Germany had territorial ambitions, the native populations would have been subjected to either extermination or brutal exploitation. Hitler saw Africans as subhuman, and colonial rule under the Nazis would have been even more brutal than the worst examples of European colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. 2. A global racial hierarchy. In a Nazi-dominated world, race would have been the defining factor in all aspects of life. The Nazis believed in a rigid racial hierarchy, with Germans and other Aryan races at the top and everyone else ranked below them. This hierarchy would have been enforced through law, education, and propaganda, resulting in the systematic oppression of non-Aryan races. Even in countries that were not directly controlled by the Nazis, fascist governments allied with the Third Reich would likely have adopted similar policies, leading to a world where racial segregation, discrimination, and violence were the norm on a global scale. Cultural suppression and indoctrination. A Nazi victory would have also had far-reaching effects on global culture. The Nazis were notorious for their suppression of free thought, the arts, and intellectualism, and they used propaganda as a tool to control the population. A Nazi-dominated world would have been one in which freedom of expression was non-existent. 1. Censorship and propaganda. In Nazi Germany, the arts, literature, and media were tightly controlled by the regime. Only works that promoted Nazi ideology were allowed, while anything that deviated from the party line was banned or destroyed. This policy would have been expanded to every country under Nazi control. Books deemed un-German would have been burned, and artists, writers, and intellectuals who opposed the regime would have been silenced or killed. The Nazis were masters of propaganda, and they used it to shape public opinion and maintain control over the population. In a world where the Nazis had won, propaganda would have been a ubiquitous part of life. The image of Hitler as a godlike figure and the glorification of Aryan supremacy would have been broadcast constantly, shaping the beliefs and attitudes of generations of people. 2. Erasure of non-Aryan cultures. Non-Aryan cultures would have been systematically erased. The Nazis believed that only Aryan culture was worthy of preservation, and they sought to eliminate any cultural expressions that did not fit their ideology. This would have led to the destruction of countless cultural traditions, languages, and histories. The Nazis would have rewritten history to serve their own purposes, erasing the contributions of non-Aryan peoples to human civilization. Science and technology under Nazi control. World War II spurred rapid advancements in science and technology, much of which was driven by the race to build weapons, including the atomic bomb. Had the Nazis won, the development of science and technology would have taken a much different course. 1. Nazi scientific research. The Nazis were interested in science, but only insofar as it could serve their ideological and military goals. Nazi scientists conducted horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners, and this kind of unethical research would likely have expanded. Medical advancements would have been pursued through inhumane means, with little regard for human life or dignity. Additionally, Nazi eugenics programs would have been ramped up, with the goal of creating a superior race through selective breeding and genetic manipulation. 2. Space exploration and nuclear weapons. It is possible that the Nazis would have pursued space exploration, as Hitler showed some interest in using rockets for military purposes. However, the nature of Nazi ideology might have slowed scientific progress in areas not directly related to warfare or racial ideology. In contrast, the development of nuclear weapons would have been a top priority. Had the Nazis succeeded in developing atomic bombs, they would have used them to cement their control over the world, either through direct military conquest or the threat of nuclear annihilation. Resistance and rebellion. While a Nazi victory would have created a dystopian world, it is unlikely that the entire world would have accepted Nazi rule without resistance. Underground movements and rebel forces would likely have continued to fight against the Nazi regime, even if open warfare had ended. 1. Global resistance movements. In Europe, resistance movements like the French Resistance would have continued to operate in secret, attempting to undermine Nazi control. In occupied countries, nationalist and communist groups would have fought against the fascist regimes imposed by the Nazis. These resistance movements might have received support from countries that were not under Nazi control, such as the United States or neutral nations like Switzerland. 2. Possible rebellions in colonized regions. In the colonies and occupied territories of Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, rebellion against Nazi rule would have been widespread. The oppressive policies of the Nazis, combined with their brutal treatment of indigenous populations, would have had superior military technology. It is possible that they would have been bogged down by insurgencies in their vast empire, similar to how colonial powers faced resistance from independence movements in the post-war period. Conclusion. A world in which the Nazis had won World War II would have been a grim and oppressive place. The Nazi regime, built on a foundation of racism, totalitarianism, and militarism, would have reshaped the world into a dystopia where freedom, diversity, and human dignity were suppressed. Europe would have been transformed into a fascist empire, with millions more people falling victim to genocide and oppression. Racial hierarchy would have been institutionalized on a global scale, and non-Aryan cultures would have been systematically erased. While there would have been resistance to Nazi rule, the world would have been marked by fear, violence, and repression. The defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 was not just a military victory but a victory for the ideals of democracy, human rights, and freedom. Had the Nazis won, the world would have lost these values, and the future of humanity would have been bleak indeed. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel for more such content.